welcome to the final lecture in the series of lectures from the Department of Philosophy and Theology here at the University of St. Francis, the department that I chair. I'm Adam DeVille. This 2 o'clock slot is sometimes known among academics and lecturers as the graveyard slot because people have a tendency after lunch to be a little bit dozy. So I'm going to try and stimulate your brain cells straight away and put you to work and to ask you to think about topics that you would like to see covered in future lectures. We have a department meeting on Friday morning, and one of the things on our agenda is to look at the 2015-16 lecture schedule. So if there's a topic in philosophy, religious studies, theology that you've always thought, I want to know more about this, or I don't understand that, or this is a very weird idea, I wish somebody would explain it to me. If you've got any of those kinds of burning interests, or if you can think of some in the next couple of minutes, I'll be here till the end and would be glad of any feedback you might have to offer. This, as I say, is our final lecture in this academic year, presented by Dr. Vincent Wargo, who is the newest member of our department, just finishing rather, I should say, his second year on campus. He was here last year as a visiting professor. And I think all of us very much hoped that he would be able to stay on, and Providence has supplied an answer to that, and a position opened up, and so he has been able to stay on as a full-time professor of philosophy here in the department. Born here in the United States, and some of his academic training here in the United States, he did his doctorate in philosophy in Europe at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and comes to us most recently from teaching in North Dakota. His topic this afternoon, Tradition Philosophically Understood. Dr. Wargo.
Let me see if I can pull this off. Thank you for coming. My interest in tradition was not necessarily theological. My training is philosophical. So I was interested in starting a conversation with my colleagues and in the other faculties in the humanities departments about what tradition might mean and how there are some interesting convergences in several disciplines, for example, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, and theology, and how we might discuss those convergences and also the divergences between our respective disciplines about how we think about tradition. So what I'm presenting you today is kind of a shotgun approach, if you'll have it, to tradition. It's got a couple ideas from the philosophy of science. It's got ideas from sociology, certainly philosophical ideas, and some theological ideas. And I wanted to canvass them in a kind of broad way to perhaps maybe start a dialogue among, like I said, some of the faculty members that I work with. Okay. Keep it up. Is that a better? Okay. Okay, fine. This is the first time I think I've ever had a microphone in my hand in this way. Okay, so let me begin with a couple ideas about the expanse of tradition. I would say that tradition probably impacts all areas of human life, human culture. And I've listed some from the formation of language to gender roles, to the division of labor, to rules of marriage and courtship, agricultural practices, technology, trade, religion, morality, philosophy. Even the way we treat our body is traditionally oriented. It's affected by a tradition. So what I hope to show you is that I think tradition is something that is all around us and is working on us and with us in our everyday life. So to kind of bring it all together in a first example, I want you to think about Christmas. Christmas is a crazy time. I mean, we have things in our house. Like I say, there's an order of the celebration, both in your religious traditions, your respective religious traditions, and in your own family traditions. right? And what I've said is, at Christmas time, objects appear in your house, personages appear in your house that are not normally there. Sometimes food, different kinds of food are available, different kinds of clothing. And these are all part of the tradition. These are all things that are handed down to us that we utilize. But on a deeper level, the tradition works in order to orientate ourselves to certain occasions or feasts. So for example, part of the tradition of Christmas is that everybody knows what's going to happen. Everybody knows that perhaps in your family you're going to sit down to dinner on the 24th and open gifts later, and then perhaps wait until the 25th. With that kind of knowledge comes certain expectations. These too are traditional. These are formed by the tradition as well. And in fact, when you routinely ask people around you, said, did you have a good Christmas? We innately can judge how our Christmas celebration was. That's part of tradition. Was it up to snuff or wasn't it? Right? And so these are the ideas that tradition isn't just about objects or things, but it's also about orientating ourselves, setting up expectations, and then giving us a way to judge these expectations. Okay? So it works on a couple different levels. Now, the real thing about tradition that I want to bring forward quickly is that it's not necessarily something that you're aware of. You're not consciously thinking about the order of your Christmas Eve night. You might simply have an expectation about what should happen. It's fun, at least in my house growing up, when people would come to our house that were new to our celebration of Christmas, they would kind of make mistakes or they would misinterpret the tradition. They would wear the wrong thing, for example, or they would say the wrong thing, and it was kind of funny. So that's a little bit part of it. And so maybe this makes sense to you. Like I said, certain things appear in our house, in our lives around the Christmas season that wouldn't appear normally. And apparently now there's a whole tradition in bad Christmas sweaters. So I thought that was kind of a joke, but apparently it lives on. There are whole websites devoted to bad Christmas sweaters. Okay? But how did that work? How did that come about? I mean, as a philosopher, I said there must be a reason for this. And so the reason I'm looking for is something like tradition. Even tradition that's built off in a bad way. Okay? So, tradition has its derivation in a couple different fundamental words, I think, that help describe it. I've chosen a couple words from Greek, Latin, and German. So, paradosis, meanings I give, essentially. The paradosis originally in Koine meant, I believe, the gift of Christ by God to his people. Okay? So part of the idea of tradition is giving on. Something is given to us, and then what we receive. The other aspect to the notion of tradition comes from our Latin words, traditio, which means the noun tradition, what we would understand. The verb tradire, to hand on, to hand over. And the past participle, traditum, that which having handed down over, or what is handed on. And so we have an idea from the Latin that tradition is composed of both the handing over and what is handed on. Okay? So, essentially in Latin, traditio is a legal term that means the transfer of ownership from someone to someone else. So what is handed down in tradition is given on in order to be possessed by somebody else. And the last word I used was the German Überlieferung, which is Leifung means to deliver, and Uber means to deliver over. So the idea of handing on, but handing over to the next generation. Okay. So I said before that I wanted to think about tradition in a lot of different ways. Well, one of the fundamental thinkers of tradition is Edward Shields, who's a sociologist. He is, interestingly enough, a friend of Michael Polanyi, a philosopher and scientist. So Shields talks about religion as the presence of things past. And I think it's interesting, you know. Most of our families, as Shields says, most of our families, at least in terms of our family generations, we are probably in contact with 2 or 3 generations on either side of us. Maybe some of us have been lucky to have great-grandparents as well. But the tradition, as Shields points out, puts us in touch with symbolic things, physical things, modes of contact that were created in a far distant past. Okay? So that our contemporary world is in fact shaped temporally. So one of Shields' favorites, one of his favorite things to say is that that a society without tradition would be a society in the state of nature. So you have to think of, if we had a society where everything was produced, all our customs, all our ways of acting were produced out of the generation itself, it would be what we call in philosophy the state of nature. And a state of nature is a pure abstraction. So there's no society without some sort of historical dimension. There's no human community possible without a historical dimension. So I brought a few, I thought I'd get a couple examples of things that are in the present that occupy our present life, or ways of conducting ourselves, that are in fact actually quite old. For example, I don't know if this works as a pointer as well. No, I don't. But right here in this engraving is a handshake. The handshake was established in Greece at 500 BC. This is the first known image of someone incorporating that gesture. The rings that we symbolize with Christian marriage don't really come from a Christian background. They come from a Roman background. They go back at least 22 centuries. So that was a Roman custom to give your intended a ring. And the last one is toasting. Toasting is a medieval custom, but in fact, it's very different than how we think of it now. When you toasted in the medieval world, you clinked glasses, and that was to say, I accept this drink you've poured into my glass, that it's not poisoned. So when you clink glasses and say, santé, it might have a different meaning in the medieval world than it would now. Okay? So sometimes traditions also get changed. So for example, clinking glasses was a sign of trust. I trust that my host is not poisoning me. Now it would not be, I think, fitting to at least have that as a kind of assumption when you're toasting in somebody's house. So those are kind of interesting ideas of how things come about and affect our daily lives, or at least how we organize our social interactions by more or less ancient traditions or customs. So like I said, in Latin we had traditio, which means tradition, tradiere, to hand on, and traditum, which is that which is handed on. And so it's interesting to think about what is handed on. separate from the act of handing it on. And different things can be handed on in different ways. So Shields mentions, says, to be cared for and to be made into a traditum depends on becoming an object of a tradition. Okay? Of the belief about the value of old and beautiful things. And so what happens is, I believe, is that anything that we hand on as traditium is in fact already incorporated into a gesture of handing over. So there is a practice which informs what is handed on. What is the base of that practice we want to find? But the things that are handed on are very much different, and they're treated differently. For example, buildings and ruins, monuments, and artifacts are all handed on from one generation to another, but they're handed on in very different ways. So for example, the top picture is a set of Roman ruins in Turkey. And they're in the more or less, they're kind of present state without much adornment or work. The bottom picture is the City Hall of Leuven, Belgium. It goes back to 1426. It's an actual functioning building. Okay? It's been handed on as well. But the manner of how that's been handed on and the manner of how these ruins are handed on are two different ways. It wouldn't be sufficient to hand over a ruin or to treat a ruin as if it was a contemporary building, and perhaps, if you can imagine the Acropolis, painting it, bringing it back to its state 25 centuries ago. Right? There's no practice that would at least allow us to think of that. A building like, this is actually the City Hall in Leuven, like I said before. You can go in it and you conduct your businesses in there. So it makes sense that it's kept up. There are other things that are, in fact, symbols themselves of what they represent. So, for example, the whole question of monuments, right? Washington, D.C. is nothing but monuments. The Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument. These are things that are erected to keep a memory alive. They are incorporating a memory themselves. And we relate to them differently. We treat them differently. Okay? So what tradition does and how it hands things on can depend on the object itself. For examples, we talked about books and artwork are also handed on. Museums are filled with artwork that's handed on. But you might not think of invention as something that could be handed on. Invention, or the value of inventing and innovating, is something that can be handed on. And in societies where that is valued, it has been handed on. In societies where it's not valued, the spark of invention is left to go out. So if you think about the history of China, there's plenty of evidence of their own technological prowess. But somehow it wasn't worked out or allowed to be handed on in a kind of systematic way. And partly because there was no tradition there was no tradition that allowed them to hand over these objects or to hand over values or to hand over skills. I was made aware of that, you know, in certain of the older churches in Europe, we don't have the technology to reproduce the stained glass that's already there. That skill is gone. We can replace the stained glass windows with new ones, but they will be from a new kind of technology. So what is handed on? Why is it handed on? And how is it handed on still becomes questionable. Okay. So even religious and philosophical ideas I mentioned can be handed on. Aristotle can be handed on as a thinker who is worthy of consideration, even if individual ideas that are part of his works are wrong. We still hold Aristotle as an example and make that something that we should want to incorporate in our current kind of philosophical curriculum. So I've picked Pascal. Pascal was probably one of the cooler heads in the Renaissance when considering the relation of science and the Enlightenment in general to the tradition. If you were to read people like Bentham, Jeremy Bentham, you would find that there was a wholesale wanting to get tradition out of society. With Pascal, he says, once we see that, he wants to hold that there is a distinction in the sciences and that physics and the empirical sciences should be run by experimentation and by reason. But theology perhaps should still have an element of tradition as part of it, right? So once we see this distinction clearly, we shall deplore the blindness of those who believe physics want to treat as valid only tradition instead of reason and experiment. And we shall be shocked at the error of those who in theology replace tradition of Scripture and the church fathers with the arguments of reason. Right? So, in the Enlightenment, there was a wave to try to replace tradition with reason itself, to reinscribe our practices, the things we do, from a point of view of a kind of objective reason. And I will try to make a point that tradition doesn't work on the objective level. It works below the objective, maybe on the subjective level. And so a counterpoint to this is Michael Polanyi. He suggests that science itself has traditions. Science has traditions of objectivity that it uses, that it passes on to each generation of researchers. So even if you think of science as a purely rational exercise, it itself is controlled by values and practices that are traditional. The value of objectivity, for example. Research. So he says science is governed by common beliefs, by virtues and practices, transmitted to succeeding generations. Each new member of the scientific community adheres to this tradition, assuming at the same time a responsibility shared by all members for reinterpreting the tradition and possibly revolutionizing its teachings. So science becomes a very different activity, at least as we understand it in the 20th century, than what it was when it first came about, I think, in the Enlightenment. Now, mostly philosophers in the Enlightenment were against the idea of tradition, except David Hume. David Hume really saw the value of tradition and custom in a way that the rationalists, philosophers on the continent, didn't see. The rationalists were more concerned about finding objective reasons for things. But David Hume had a particular insight, we might say. David Hume objected to the notion of causality. He says, how do we know that if A, then B? That is antecedents and consequences. He said, all we see is if we light a match, if we strike a match on a table and it lights, we can't say that there was a causal relationship between my striking the match on the table and the match lighting. All we can say is that there that there are these two events that seem to be linked. So cause and effect for David Hume were just linked by human association, by custom. Custom itself was a principle of argumentation. Why do we do something? Because that's the way it's done. Why do we think A is the cause of B? Because that's our custom. So, thus he says, custom is a great guide of human life. It is the principle alone which renders our experience useful to us and makes us expect for the future a similar train of events with those that have appeared in the past. Without the influence of custom, we should be entirely ignorant of every matter of fact beyond what is immediately present to us. So, in a sense, David Hume is the first person in the history of philosophy to begin to think of custom and tradition as principles for explaining what we do. And so I took a contemporary philosopher who's a philosopher of practice, and I found this quote about David Hume. What Hume called customs are intersubstitutable with principles. They are not only first principles, but they are in a sense better because they are more first than principles. Now think about that. That's rather strange. A first principle in philosophy, going all the way back in the philosophical tradition to Aristotle, was where you begin an explanation. You can't get beyond first principles. There's no more first than them. So all of a sudden, custom becomes a first principle. It becomes the beginning of a conversation. It becomes the ultimate reasons of why you can justify something. Okay? So he says that they are better than first principles. For example, if you're looking for first principles to explain and justifying something we already do, so the attempt to provide grounding principles by traditional philosophers is an attempt to substitute something explicit and universal for practices. And so my question to you, to everybody here is, how does tradition help us explain who we are? What evidence does that provide for us, right? And why is it sometimes better than an objective explanation? Since it somehow becomes substitutable with them in certain arguments. Arguments about why we do what we do. Is to give a reason better than to show the evidence of the practice itself. So one thing about tradition is that almost all philosophers and theologians agree that there is such a thing as tradition with a capital T and small traditions with a lowercase t. The smaller traditions come and go, whereas something like the tradition holds fast through. I like the example that a German philosopher, Joseph Pieper, says. He mentions that growing up, before there being sliced bread, the patriarch of the family would take a new loaf of bread, take the knife, and make the sign of the cross over it, and then cut the bread. He said, with the invention of sliced bread, that tradition passed away. Right? And you have to think of this, and I think you can use your imagination in a lot of ways. There is something symbolic, right, about making a sign of a cross over bread. There's something eventful to cutting a loaf of bread for the first time. If you make a mistake, you can screw up pieces of bread. So you have to do it right. But with sliced bread, there is no event of cutting the bread. You just kind of unconsciously grab it, put your hand in the bag and pull out a slice. So the occasion for that tradition is no longer available. It is no longer significant. And so that tradition has passed away. But other traditions carry on. So I have a couple different people. I have Yves Congar, who is a Dominican theologian, Joseph Pieper, philosopher, and Michael Poliani. And so each of them want to talk differently about how there is such a thing as tradition with a capital T and traditions with lowercase t. So Congar says, a written text can exist independently of the living act of its transmission. That makes sense. We've already seen that with the idea of the traditum. What is handed on versus the act of handing it on. So the Christmas story is somehow set, but certain elements of it can change. That is, when you have dinner, when you open your gifts, how that's orchestrated, but certain parts of it may stay the same. That is, an overall sense of what's happening. With Pieper, he says the tradition speaks to us with authority about unchangeable things, whereas traditions express the authority of the tradition according to changeable circumstances. And so, if we can think about an overall context in which the meaning that we give to individual parts, let's say, of the Christmas story or of our Christmas tradition and how they make sense and they're brought into focus, then we can begin to think about what's the difference between a tradition and traditions. Poliani talks about the tradition as that which is a kind of tacit knowledge, a knowledge which is passed on in the very gestures that and structures that scientists go through in their formation of becoming scientists. So this idea of tacit knowledge again is in opposition to this idea of objective knowledge. That is, my presence to you probably suggests more to you than my words. My gestures can be seen to be friendly or not friendly based on how you interpret them, how you see them. And they give context to what I say. These kind of tacit things are picked up and are part of the tradition. They themselves steer us towards what is the tradition in the smaller sense. So I want to look at some of these three in a little more detail. For Joseph Pieper, who is a Thomist, the essence of tradition is tradire, or what he says, tradendum. That is, the essence of tradition is that it be passed on, or that it must be passed on. So he says tradition is not primarily a reception of something from another generation, but it is the passing on. Tradition as a handing down, he says, requires three things. And I think these are important to kind of understand what he wants to talk about. And he says the handing down requires three places. Someone, he says, who stands in his own position, hands something down from somewhere else to another person. So if you think of what Pieper is trying to describe here is, I, handing down the tradition, receive it from someplace else, from the past generation, and I hand it down to the next generation. The idea is, he doesn't emphasize reception because the tradition itself for Pieper is not something that is a possession. we don't personally possess the traditions that we hand down. They're not personal possessions. They more occupy a sphere that's interpersonal as such. Okay? So he says it's not a personal, it's not to be understood or to be learned, but to believe. That's a very, he's probably unique in his idea of what a tradition is, and the emphasis that its tradition relies mostly in handing down rather than receiving. But for him, as we'll see, the tradition is the communication with the divine, that is, revelation. And revelation for Pieper is not something that we possess on a personal level. So the handing it on makes sense for him in the sense of keeping that communication alive, keeping that revelation alive. The next person I want to talk about is Maurice Blondel. Here he says the essence of tradition is creative reception. For Blondel, the reception of the tradition is the most important thing, because your reception, as he says, a truly supernatural teaching is only viable and conceivable if the initial gift is a seed capable of progressive and continual growth. The divine and human word of Christ did not fix itself in immobility. Jesus wrote only in the sand and impressed his words only in the air. His living teaching comes to mobile and inconstant minds. So for him, the reception is important because the tradition must be received in order to be creatively possessed and truly lived. Blondel, at the time that he wrote this, was revolutionary. He was around 1906. He was one of the first laymen to talk about this in these terms, and it made a lot of people uncomfortable. Yves Congar, the Dominican, actually quotes Blondel a lot in some of his major texts. Now, Blondel's position is also, you can see this position in certain philosophical circles. The whole tradition of continental philosophy going back from Martin Heidegger to Jacques Derrida all talk about if you want to receive the tradition, you have to question it. Questioning is the only possibility for the capacity to receive it. So, again, Blondel, he marks out a whole kind of position in terms of the thought around tradition. Tradition is about reception. Congar, I said, the tradition is a normative content inseparable from its communication. For Congar, the tradition is received through the traditions that the church has in place. The tradition itself, obliges, what he says, the whole people, while traditions are a particular application of the tradition. So, particular traditions of the church that were present and are now gone, don't necessarily reflect the whole tradition of the church. I mean, for him, traditions supply the occasion for the recollection of tradition. Okay? It's a little more complicated than this with Congar. Congar suggests that the tradition of the church is as important as Scripture itself, especially in understanding Scripture. For Congar, and for most, I think, theologians that are in his vein, the idea that the apostles and the church fathers, when they thought of the scriptures, they didn't think of the New Testament because that didn't exist. What they thought of as the scriptures were the Old Testament. The gospel was what they were preaching. So for them, the tradition, they say in Greek, is agraphos, that is, not written. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that the tradition was simply just what was oral. The tradition was everything that was gestured, valued, and that could be seen to, and the practices that were there, the breaking of the bread, those rituals, those were informative to the formation of what we would consider the New Testament, to the scriptures. So the idea of a sola scriptura, that is, by scripture alone, wouldn't make sense to someone like Congar, because the practice is already present prior to the formation of the New Testament. It actually informs probably the writing of the New Testament. Okay? So maybe I should stop because I feel like I'm going very quickly through a lot of things. So we've got these divergent ideas. But one thing we should see about tradition is that it's not necessarily what's explicit. It's what's implicit. But what we can turn to something, what we can make explicit to a certain degree if we start asking ourselves why we're doing something. So when I said about practices, how can they be the guide as a first principle for understanding stuff? Well, the church is really an example of that, right? Why are we doing what we do? Why do we see value in what we do, right? Going back to the practices and reflecting on them makes sometimes explicit what's implicit, right? Sometimes we value things based on the practices that have been handed down. I was talking with a colleague who said that in his family, certain traditional dishes were cooked, and that some of his children picked that up and claimed that as their tradition, even though it was never explicitly said, this is something you should do. It's simply caught, as some people try to suggest, or try to, they catch something in that gesture, in the value of what's being done. And I think that's the way you have to think about the tradition that informs the traditions of the church, right? Now, again, it becomes more complicated for Congar as well, because he'll say, the tradition of the church is the mission of the church. Well, what's the mission of the church? To proclaim the gospel. Right? And how is that passed on? For Congar, it's through the Holy Spirit, the act of the Holy Spirit that informs the body of the church in the movement of that tradition, in the reception of that tradition and passing it on. Okay? It's very interesting. He has a part in his book, Tradition and Traditions, where he talks about the magisterium. And the magisterium is the formal teaching organ of the church where definitively we think tradition is somehow, or I shouldn't say tradition, but probably orthodoxy or dogma is formulated. And he says, really, he says, you shouldn't think of the magisterium as a place where people are trying to come up with very tight, refined definitions. He says on his suggestion, the magisterium of the church is a place where they're trying to keep alive all the divergent elements of the tradition so that they can be passed on. So they don't the idea is not to rigidify them into too definite or too sparsely defined ideas, but to keep them as full of life and as robust as they possibly can. So if we understand that, if you have the question how tradition can be passed on, if you are a theologian, you may invoke the Holy Spirit. But if you're a sociologist and a philosopher, you may not feel so comfortable invoking the Holy Spirit at this level. And then, so at this point, I want to turn a little bit to the theory of Pierre Bourdieu. He was a French sociologist in the 20th century, and he essentially tried to explain the organization of society through the concept of habitus. Habitus goes all the way back to Aristotle, and it sounds like what it is, habits. But he says habits are not something that they're not a mindless routine, but they're essentially the building up of an active condition in a person to respond and to in a certain way. So Aristotle talked about habits in relationship to virtues. You build up virtues not by creating a routine that's mindless, but by putting people in a situation and training them or helping them build the capacity to be courageous, build the capacity to be generous, build the capacity to judge wisely and be just. And these aren't habits in the sense of mindless things, but these are ways of actualizing, we would say, the human essence in order to act more fully, to be engaged in the real world. So I think what he says is kind of interesting. He says habitus as embodied history, and he literally means that, right? Internalized as a second nature, and so forgets history and is the active presence of the whole past. So in the first idea, for habitus, it is a kind of second nature. Second nature that builds off of what human beings are, their natural capacity, but actualizes them according to a kind of social structure, history. It actually marks the body in terms of a history, how things have been done in the past. So we have in the notion of habitus the coming together of what is cultural and what is natural. That's very interesting for philosophers, right? Because usually you oppose these two concepts. What is cultural was one way, and what is natural is another way. So Aristotle and Bourdieu have figured a way to incorporate the two. Okay? So he says that habitus is a system of durable, transposable dispositions, structuring structures, predisposed to function as structuring structures. That is, he says, he has Latin words for these, the opus operatum and the modus operandi. So you're getting a little course in Latin here, I'm sorry about that. But the idea is that a habitus is something that is traditionally passed on, so it's a structuring structure. As it's passed on, it forms the disposition of the individuals to which it's passed on to. And as possessed or received, it also structures their responses, but not in a mechanical way. Bourdieu was kind of arguing the same argument that Hume had. He was saying, it doesn't make sense to talk about human beings following a set of objective rules when you're talking about their interaction with each other in society. He says, that's not true. That's not true to our experience. Our interactions with each other are spontaneous. We're not rule followers, nor does it make sense to describe these things as a sociologist in this kind of objective manner. So we move to an internal, more subjective experience of this phenomena. Okay? And habitus is that. So, and like I said before, this disposition which a habit can create is the ability itself to act. And then the next part is habitus have a nearly infinite capacity for generating thought, products, perceptions, expressions, and actions. That is, a habit or a habitus can be something like an identifiable style. A style can be identifiable but nearly infinite in its reach. Okay? So if you go back to the idea of the Christmas celebration, the habit and the tradition of Christmas creates disposition in all of us who celebrate that holiday on how to react, what to expect, how to know if we really celebrated the holiday in the right way. Okay? And we can each judge that. And we judge the interaction we have with each other when we celebrate that holiday. So it's not simply a subjective capacity, but it's a capacity to act with each other as such. And lastly, habitus was the notion of a bodily hexis. Hexis is a Greek word that, again, comes from Aristotle. But it simply means the active condition, which is what we would call a disposition. To be disposed to be courageous means that you have that disposition at hand and can readily use that. And being courageous doesn't mean just jumping out in front of trains, but knowing when to be courageous, for what reason to be courageous, for who, and for what reason. All of that. So it's also a kind of knowledge. That active idea, that active condition also orients us in the world. And so the bodily, habitus as a bodily hexis is interesting because I'm trying to think of if I can use another Greek word. I'm using too many Greek words. Mimesis. And I want to propose that's different from imitation. An imitation, I would say, is when I'm consciously watching you and trying to imitate your moves and your gestures. But sometimes we actively incorporate, a mimesis, the gestures or the moves of other people into our own body. I know that sounds crazy, but think about almost everything about style in contemporary culture is about that. I mean, how we walk. What is the walk of a young person? What is the walk of a self-confident young person? What's the walk of a man versus a woman? Do they have different walks? Do they all walk the same? How do they express themselves in their walks? Another French sociologist, Marcel Mauss, did a whole work, and he said, in 1950s came out, why French women walked in a certain way. And apparently, it was the reason was a few American films had made it into France at that time, and unconsciously or not, it was adopted by younger women of that generation, and it was a kind of Sondering walk that had not been seen in France before that. But how are things, like I said, how are these bodily impressions passed on? I would also say that in another way, if you think about the sacraments are the gestures of Christ. These are actions of Christ that have become gestures of the church, right? I don't know if anybody broke bread and said, "This is my body," before Jesus said that, right? But now that action is incorporated into our liturgy, and it's for the sake of embodying something. that embodiment isn't just a representation, but an enfleshment of that reality in the world. Okay? And so, what we think of, if we think in terms of a dualistic system of the mind and the body as separate, Bardou's theory of habitus would suggest otherwise, that human beings really are a unity in their lived experience. So, the last few slides are a little bit about how do traditions change and where do they come from. And so I refer back again a little bit to some sociological distinctions. There are external and internal forms of change. And so they're pretty interesting. Externally, when we enter upon the presence of other traditions, our traditions might change and their traditions might change insofar as they're perceived by each other. This happens usually through emissaries, merchants, soldiers, and it has a profound thinking on the traditions that they affect. So I give you an example from philosophy. Descartes, in his Meditations, talks about his military experience as being transforming. Why? Because he realized once he left France that other people did things, had practices, and did them in different ways than the French. And there was no particular universal way of doing certain activities. That caused him to try to think more rationally and objectively if there is some sort of explanatory ground for this. But the sheer fact of these things can make us disquiet. They can change our practice. The second one is reception of an alien tradition. Inevitably, we modify them. We modify them based on some assumption that allows us to grasp this new tradition. That is, why do we think a tradition is important? What do we think is the most important aspect of a certain tradition? We might, for example, distort the tradition based on that idea. And again, I was thinking of children, for example. Children, I think, constantly misinterpret their parents, being a parent. I know that we normally hear that parents don't understand children. Well, I want to reverse that and say children don't understand parents. Because we say a lot of things, but children pick up on one thing and then they make that their kind of ongoing, that's the most important value, when in our mind, it was one of several values. I don't know if that's been your experience. So I'm trying to think of an elaborate example that I can, that my kids wouldn't be angry with me telling you all. But I think that's part of it. So the reception of a tradition itself might be its modification, because the conditions for the possibility of receiving something is that we choose certain aspects of that tradition that become important. So a colleague was telling me that in his house, cooking, one of his children prepared a kind of bread dish, but only saw one aspect of it, which was completely arbitrary to the actual production of this dish. And so it was very interesting to say, yes, that's possible. And when he was telling me this, I was thinking of Edward Shields' commentary on that. Sometimes traditions change because the circumstances change. And again, the example of that would be Joseph Pieper's example of the bread. We no longer make a cross on the loaf of bread because we no longer need to cut it. And that action that imitates Christ's breaking of the bread is no longer there for us. It's no longer available to us. So this, with the circumstances being changed, the tradition falls away. Other things we've talked about, other things that sociologists talk about is the expansion or contraction around what they call around a center, a social center. And what they mean by that is, how to explain this? When people immigrate to the United States, that first generation keep most of their cultural practices that they've inherited. So traditional foods, for example, maybe languages. But as the family progresses in the States, they tend to lose those kind of traditional foods, or are no longer speaking their native language as such. And so there is a kind of what we call expansion towards the center. Everybody gets changed. So from my experience, I grew up in a Romanian-Hungarian family, which meant that I was destined to eat a lot of sauerkraut all winter, which I kind of liked, not really, but my kids have never had sauerkraut. And my grandfather was from Hungary. So already in 3 generations, that whole practice of eating Middle European foods is pretty much gone from my family. And the last way that traditions change is that sometimes, like we said, particular beliefs within a larger tradition can grow and influence how that tradition is understood. So, and this happens a lot of times. For example, one way to think about it is how we treat prisoners. You know, what is the reason? What's the reason for imprisoning people? Is it an act of justice? Is it an act of rehabilitation? Is it simply to get them off the street? So is it punishment? Is it to get them off the street, or is it rehabilitation? Historically, those values shape how we consider what prison should be like. And they come back and fall out of vogue. So one of my last 2 slides is whether traditions are invented or discovered. And this probably speaks to the heart of the matter when you're thinking about religious traditions. And so I tried to get just a group of 3 different views. Eric Hobsbawm is a sociologist, and he's looking at the example of tartans, so the Scottish tartans. He says the idea that tartans were family possessions, or that specific patterns were family possessions, isn't very old. It's actually rather recent. It's only about 150 years old. So the idea of the traditional tartan with a family name was invented. It was made up. Other examples of this would be things like after the revolution in France, the new French Republic wanted to institute holidays that weren't religious in character. So one of the holidays that they instituted was the Philosopher's Day, a short-lived holiday that didn't have much backing, even in France. So it quickly went to the wayside because there wasn't any tradition to back it up. And by tradition, we mean habitus. Joseph Pieper has a very different idea of tradition, and a very different idea of what culture is. He has the idea that the sacred tradition has its source in the communication of the divine with men. And in fact, he says that the culture doesn't come from technology or the arts, but from cultus, the celebration of the divine. So for Pieper, the very source of society is their cultic celebrations. And keeping alive those cultic celebrations is important for the continuation of the society. And then I think you understand a little bit why the tradire, the passing it on, becomes important for people. And the last, I took Dei Verbum, which is, as Professor Kumper spoke 2 weeks ago about the last session of the Vatican Council. And so I took this, and I don't know if you can read this, but I thought it was interesting. The tradition is that which comes from the apostles, developed in the church with the help of the Holy Spirit. For there is a growth in the understanding of the realities and the words which have been handed down. This happens through the contemplation and study made by believers who treasure these things in their hearts, through a penetrating understanding of the spiritual realities which they experience, and through the preaching of those who have received through the episcopal succession the sure gift of truth. So this quote I tried to use suggests that maybe not tradition with a capital T, but traditions develop. And they are organic from a tradition as such. And so you can see that we can look at the spectrum of these ideas in that sense, right? That they're completely arbitrary, that they do have a kind of, they are discovered within a tradition that encompasses them as such. And so when you're thinking about traditions, I think discovery is a better word than invention, in my opinion. And lastly, I wanted to leave you with this from Pierre Bardou. It's his schema for the development of orthodoxy. And so I should try to describe it to you. In a group, he says, there is everything that can be said, talked about, and spoken is opinion. And out of this, the group forms either what they consider an orthodox opinion or a heterodox opinion. But how you resolve that is through something that's not discussed. And that's the doxa per se. So he uses the terms a little bit differently than we would in theology. But this idea that there is a universe of tacit knowledge or habits that are informative to a discussion that's explicit. So there is always a limit, I'm trying to say, between what is explicit and what is implicit. And somehow, what is implicit probably situates what's explicit. And when people are trying to argue back and forth about what is the case and what's not the case, they somehow have to look at the assumptions about those things that are implicit, right? So in Bardou's model, the universe of the undiscussed, the doxa, is constantly made use of and is in fact sometimes made explicit, certain aspects of it. It becomes formalized, right? It would be the same way of talking about, I think, and here again, I may be overstepping my reach here of being a philosopher. It would be the same way of talking about the early heresies that the church fathers had to tackle. They didn't. What would they use in their defense? They would use the practice of the church, the preaching of the gospel, the celebration of the Eucharist, that are implied. They're not written down, and those get formulated into dogma. And that formulation then becomes historicized. But that dogma itself will probably be developed from something that isn't explicit at that point, but implicit. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for those of you who are interested to ask some questions. And perhaps as you're gathering your thoughts, I'll start off with one. I've been thinking a lot about forgetting lately.
Forgetting.
Perhaps, yeah, perhaps paradoxically, for a paper I'm working on, and I'm reading Ricoeur's, one of his last books, Memory, History, and Forgetting.
Okay.
He makes a rather paradoxical point in there that tradition to live has to be able to forget.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say to that? In other words, if it's going to survive, it's going to be dynamic. It has to be able at times to set things aside and say, we're not going to focus on this. We're going to focus instead on this. Or we're going to retrieve this and let this go.
I think of this as partly being a phenomenologist and a Heideggerian. About 5-6 years ago, there's a New York Yankee who went through a hitting slump. He couldn't hit the ball to save his life. He was on a multi-million-dollar contract. And so the Yankees first tried to get him to, concentrate and think about it more, and it was worse. Half the season was gone, and he wasn't producing what they wanted. And so effectively, they had to essentially say, stop worrying about it. Don't think about it. Don't make it a conscious thing. Make it relax and try to regain the habitus that you had prior to this hiccup. And yes, I think in one sense, conscious thought, a conscious memory, probably makes an experience explicit, and it probably limits it by being explicit. Because to be explicit means to put it in so many words. Okay? But an experience itself, when I look at something or when I'm just walking through, it's open-ended. But as soon as you start to remember it, make it explicit, it starts to get I hate to do this, a categorical form. There's Immanuel Kant back on you. So yeah, so thinking too hard will ruin your batting average and probably not help you as a.
Let me follow up on Adam's comment, because I think this might be another piece of the same story. If I would take as a metaphor of a tradition, driving on the right side.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we do that not only with cars, we do that on bicycle paths, we do that in boats.
Mm-hmm.
We still drive on the right side. And we forget why we do that. And the historical reason is really irrelevant. Because the momentum, the value of doing it this way, all of those things that we could be conscious and reflect about are all made subsidiary. They're made part of the doing of it without even having to think about it.
Exactly, and that's the value of it.
So it's just automatic. We walk down the halls in our buildings, and we start walking on the right side of the hall because it works. And it works because it's been experienced to work, and it's so integrated that if you ask people why they do that, they'll not know. So I think the forgetting is in part the value of not paying attention to words, not paying attention to reasons, which is the mistake you were referring to earlier in terms of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. That you lose that when you start paying attention to the paper. It's using the paper and what it's going to be used for.
Exactly. I think the driving on the, that's a good example. I think you made an excellent comment. I remember as an undergraduate, Richard Dreyfuss, what's his name? I think it's Herbert Dreyfuss came to our college. Herbert Dreyfuss was a professor of philosophy at UC Berkeley. And he mentioned another idea of habit or conditioning. And he said he and his brother, who was a professor of mathematics, were given a contract by the US military to write an AI program that would automate tanks. Okay? So he said, so his brother said, hey, you might find this interesting. So he dragged him along to an army base where they were training young tank commanders. Okay? And part of the training of tank commanders was that they go inside and they're told, strategic things. Like you are to find a position in your tank where you can fire on other tanks, but they can't fire on you. Okay? Strategic position. Then they're led out into a playing field or a field and said, go and find that. Right? So inevitably, what happens is they're trying to map their intellectual knowledge onto a real-life situation. That mapping cannot be made explicit, right? That habit of doing that can't be made. You have to just do it, and then eventually, good tank commanders realize where the right place to put their tank is. It becomes intuitive, just like hitting the ball. Just like the baseball. You sometimes have to forget about the rules in order to incorporate that active condition. And I guess maybe this is a way to explain it in terms of a kind of knowledge rather than a skill. So traditions, I would say, work to create expectations, the manner of how we are oriented in certain activities, and again, gives us the ability to assess whether we have done the task in a right way, whether Christmas was celebrated right or not, whether we enjoyed it, whether it was fitting, maybe.
Hi there. I don't really have a question, but I think I have an example of a tradition, and tell me if you think I'm on the right track. Okay, so you're probably familiar with Garrison Keillor, the radio show host and humorist. And I don't know, a couple years ago, for some reason, he did a Christmas show, but he was in Hawaii, of all places. And, my thought was, well, good for you, you're in Hawaii. But instead, what he did, and so he is from Minnesota and all, so instead what he did during the show was he called friends in Minnesota to talk about how Christmas was going in Minnesota. And so he asked about the weather and what they were cooking and when they were going to church. And it was just, for me, it was like, I think he was out of his element in Hawaii and really wanted to find out what was happening back in the Minnesota Christmas. I don't know, would that be
Yeah, no, exactly, because then I think that's a good example, because certain things that a Minnesota Christmas would incorporate wouldn't be possible or would be funny in Hawaii. It would be funny to sit around and drink hot chocolate and be next to a fire when it's 85 degrees out. I mean, it won't make sense, but it's true. And I think I put those awful sweaters. I mean, people know that they wear awful sweaters, and it's a kind of a fun dig at the Christmas tradition. They are awful because we know they're awful. They don't wear them because they think they're good looking, and they're pretty sure that you'll find them awful too. How is that possible? How do we recognize style? And if you see that, then you can see something like also how artistic traditions come up, how traditions of value in art as such are passed on. I think there's someone back here.
Mike, I have a technical question, and that is simply, are these slides available that you can email
Yeah, that's true. I had originally, I thought, I originally started making my notes onto slides, and I didn't know. I thought it was interesting to keep the original quotations from the people. So yeah, I think they will be, can be made available. Though I do have to say that some of the pictures I may have to retract because I'm not sure if they're completely public domain.
Gentlemen, for your attention, and stay tuned and watch the department's website for details of the lecture series for next year. Good afternoon.